Back in 1961, when WWF started, most TVs were black and white. A young presenter called David Attenborough was appearing on our screens. We believed burning coal was the best source of power. We thought the ocean was so big, nothing could harm it. And the tropical rainforests would always be there. Back then, we thought conservation was mostly about protecting animals in trouble. We didn't know we'd end up having to protect the entire natural world.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of this series looking at the connection between environmentalism and imperialism. You've just heard a clip from a World Wildlife Fund promotional video celebrating their achievements after 60 years and laying out the challenges for the future. The presentation goes on to claim that, by working alongside local communities, populations of wild pandas, mountain gorillas, and tigers have recovered, whilst the Indus River dolphin has been brought back from the brink of extinction. The WWF has worked to acquire legal protections for wild places, such as rainforests, by pushing global governments to pass new nature laws. The next 10 years will, apparently, shape the future of life on our planet. But if we act now, we are reassured that by 2030, we will be living in a healthier, recovering world. This all sounds lovely. But is everything quite as it seems? Is conservation really as cuddly as a panda bear? Does the WWF and the wider movement actually act to protect the entire natural world? Or is there a darker side to all of this? That's what I'll be exploring in this episode. I'll begin by touching on the issue of greenwashing.
We follow the trail that leads to Wilmar's Musticus embulu palm oil plantation. In central Kalimantan alone, the corporation has 18 subsidiaries. For one of these companies, namely the Musticus embulu plantation, the corporation has obtained a sustainability certificate. This means that Wilmar is able to sell 360,000 tons of certified palm oil for higher prices on the European market. The certificate is everything. After all, who can say for sure which palm nuts came from which plantation? The nuts have to be processed as quickly as possible. The fresher they are, the more oil they give. The mills run 24 hours a day. Everything ends up on the same conveyor, even nuts from illegally cleared land. The waste is meant to be used as fertilizer, but in reality the majority of it is simply dumped. The only sustainable thing about Wilmar palm oil seems to be environmental destruction. Despite this, they've got a certificate, a greenwashed pack of lies.
Greenwashing is the practice of assisting corporations, or even nation-states, by helping them create a green image whilst they continue their environmentally destructive practices. For example, the World Wildlife Fund receives fees from over 500 companies for membership to their Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. To quote the journalist, and I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, but I think it's Wilfried Huismann, from his book PandaLeaks, quote, "All of them are on board because the sustainable label spells profit. Not only that, but since the EU Renewable Energy Act came into effect in 2010, recognised sustainability certification has been a prerequisite for selling palm oil on the European biofuel market." End quote. The WWF provides this service for a fee, and as there is no independent oversight, Huismann claims companies are still free to clear-cut primary rainforests, safe behind their sustainability certificates. The ex-head of the human rights organisation, Save Our Borneo, sums the situation up by saying, quote, "The WWF greenwashes the environmental crimes of industry, and even takes money for doing it." End quote. Greenwashing can be utilised by nation-states too. In 2022, US environmental organisation the Sierra Club briefly cancelled a tour of Israel after receiving condemnation from a coalition of human rights groups, including Jewish Voice for Peace. To quote an article on MondoWise, quote, The trip descriptions tout Israel's success in preserving significant spaces for nature reserves, forests, and national parks. But Israel's apartheid and colonization are not green. As Visualizing Palestine notes, Israel uses parks, nature reserves, and forests to conceal the ruins of depopulated Palestinian villages, appropriate land, and curtail Palestinian access and development. 182 Palestinian villages that were depopulated by Israel are concealed in Israeli parks and forests, preventing refugees from returning. End quote. The Sierra Club, predictably, quickly reinstated the trip after protests from such groups as the Anti-Defamation League. The director apologized for the confusion, anger, and frustration caused, condemned anti-Semitism, and said that the club did not take positions on foreign policy matters as they lacked the deep understanding or knowledge necessary to do so. Days later, they would condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Another aspect to consider is that of imposed regulatory burden. In the last episode, I looked at how American nature reserves were, paradoxically, supported by the timber industry as a way of preventing competitors from entering the market. This is an example of corporations using state regulations to attack their competition. Another form of this is the imposition of regulatory burden. As an example, Heinz acquired a virtual monopoly in the tomato ketchup market after the company developed a way to make ketchup without additives. As soon as they'd done so, they supported health regulations that banned the use of additives altogether. Another example would be Walmart's support for increasing the minimum wage, a cost they can bear more easily than their smaller competitors. Whatever you think of food additives or the minimum wage is besides the point. The point is that there are non-altruistic reasons why large corporations support these things that have nothing to do with either the health or the material well-being of the population. Back in Borneo, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil certification costs around $70,000. Why might multinational corporations actually be keen to pay this? Because it's a tiny price to keep all small local producers permanently locked out of the industry. They could, of course, never afford such a fee. Even people supportive of the conservation and wider environmental movement wouldn't exactly be shocked that greenwashing takes place. Indeed, they are probably the people that highlight it the most. What is a little more shocking, however, is the relationship between conservation and ethnic cleansing.
There is a link between colonialism and conservation. Conservation exists because of colonialism. So if we look back in the history of how the national parks were created in Asia and Africa, what we realize is that, yes, the idea of national park was born in the US. But then, during the expansion of colonial empires, it's this model of protected area where humans are evicted from their land that applies in Africa.
That was the voice of Fiore Longo, a director at Survival International, an NGO which supports the rights of Indigenous peoples. Dr. Longo is talking about a link between conservation and colonialism, asserting that the former is essentially a continuation of the latter, colonialism by other means. The conservation movement has a history going back to the 19th century, with the creation of the Yosemite National Park and the eventual eviction of its indigenous inhabitants. I'm going to focus on the period after World War II, however, where imperialistic practices in general were undergoing a rebranding exercise. Concepts like the white man's burden and assertions of European superiority were no longer viable as justifications for the colonial enterprise. New ones had to be sought. One form this took was that of fighting a global communist conspiracy. This legitimized a series of overthrows of foreign governments by the CIA, which coincidentally were always replaced with ones more conducive to US corporate interests. This began in the 1950s with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, where Standard Oil benefited, and Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, to the benefit of the United Fruit Company. Dozens of such operations took place during the Cold War era. The overthrown governments almost never had any substantial ties to Moscow, and were mostly not even especially left-leaning. What really gives the game away, however, is that this was a continuation of a policy that dates back to at least the overthrow of the Hawaiian government in 1893. This was carried out in the interests of sugar and fruit corporations. In the years following, coups were fomented in Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. All very obvious examples of naked imperialism. As an example of the shift that took place, the US invasion of the Philippines at the start of the 20th century had been justified as a civilizing mission. During the debate that raged as to whether to conquer the islands or not, President William McKinley's mind settled on the thought that, quote, "There was nothing left for us to do but take them all, and to educate the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could for them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." End quote. After World War II, when the US government wanted to retake the islands, the civilizing mission argument was out of date, so the Filipino independence fighters, the Hawk rebels, were simply branded as communists. During the recolonization, tens of thousands of Filipino villagers were driven from their ancestral lands to make way for the lumber and sugar industries. Under the cover of fighting a communist insurgency, the land was essentially ethnically cleansed. So what does this have to do with the conservation movement? Well, it seems that in other areas, conservation and not communism was the justification for such ethnic cleansing. To take an example from PandaLeaks, in 1940, Britain declared the Serengeti to be the first national park in East Africa. It became a worldwide tourist sensation. The Maasai tribesmen, who had herded cattle in the Serengeti for centuries, were initially guaranteed the right to remain, then had that right revoked due to the wishes of both tourists and conservationists. As it was no longer so easy just to move the natives off their land, a justification had to be sought. In 1956, German wildlife conservationist Bernhard Grzimek published his book, No Place for Wild Animals. He claimed that Africa's wild animals are doomed to extinction. Grzimek became convinced that the Maasai farming would transform the forests to deserts, and that a nature reserve, free of any human habitation, must be created. In the soft racism of post-colonial language, he wrote, quote, "We Europeans must teach our black brothers the value of their own possessions, not because we are older or cleverer, but because we do not want them to repeat our mistakes and sins." End quote. The Maasai had, of course, herded cattle in the Serengeti for hundreds of years. Conservationist David Weston, who lived in Kenya, commented that, quote, "The herdsmen are actually the reason that there are still so many wild animals here." End quote. The colonial authorities had the Maasai chiefs sign an agreement to leave the park voluntarily. The chiefs could neither read nor write and had no idea what they were agreeing to. 100,000 Maasai lost their homeland. Let's look over to India now.
Tribal peoples across India are having their lives destroyed by conservation. Hundreds and thousands of tribal peoples have been evicted or threatened with eviction from their forests in the name of tiger conservation. These are the very same people who have protected those forests and coexisted with the tigers and other wildlife for generations. But these people are being targeted. They are being threatened, harassed, tricked into agreeing to so-called voluntary relocations. They say they're voluntary, they're not forced, but Survival has investigated evictions and threats of eviction in tiger reserves across India, and we've found the same story everywhere. People are arrested for collecting firewood, or they're threatened. In some places, they're even shot and killed. This is the environment in which people are being asked to voluntarily accept relocation. People tell us again and again, it wasn't a choice, we had no choice. They told us we had to go. And they're then pushed into these horrible resettlement camps, or in some places just given money and sent on their way to try and find a new life somewhere else. This is brutal, and it is not only devastating for the communities, it's also devastating for the environment and for tiger conservation.
That was the voice of Sophie Grigg, a senior research officer at Survival International, talking about tiger conservation projects in India and the brutal effect they have on Indigenous peoples. In a moment, I'll look at some modern examples of this, in India and elsewhere, but first I'm going to play a slightly longer clip to provide some historical context. The following clip is of Ashley Dawson, a professor of English specialising in post-colonial studies. Professor Dawson is talking about the British East India Company's policies in the 19th century, which are eerily reminiscent of what is going on in conservation today.
Now, the kind of fortress conservation policies that we've seen playing out in Kaziranga and that are motivated by recognition of the sixth extinction have their roots in European powers' recognition of the destruction of ecosystems in colonial territories such as the Caribbean and India. Conservation policies in these territories and in settler colonies like South Africa and the United States were often animated by a desire to protect valuable timber supplies as well as quote-unquote game, the charismatic megafauna that wealthy white men like to hunt. I want to place the events I've described in and around Kaziranga National Park in historic context by taking us back to conservation policies established over India's vast forests by the British East India Company in the 18th and 19th centuries. Keen to increase agricultural productivity in India in order to generate more tax revenue, the East India Company oversaw policies of forest clearance in order to open more land for cultivation. The growth of British rule in the 18th century thus led to a rapid increase in the rate of forest destruction. Nonetheless, concern about the rapid depletion of India's forests grew quickly after the loss of the American colonies and the initiation of wars against the French Revolution and Napoleon. In this context of heightened inter-imperial competition, timber reserves became a source of primary strategic concern, particularly for the Royal Navy. In 1805, the East India Company therefore set up a forest committee to investigate the possibility of using mature teak trees from India's forests for masts for Royal Navy ships, among other things. The findings of this inquiry were devastating. The committee flatly contradicted previous assumptions about the unlimited nature of teak supplies in India's forests, documenting instead the virtually complete exhaustion of wood in easily accessible regions of the subcontinent and the logistical and economic difficulties of tapping distant, unmapped forests. The committee recommended that India's teak forests be protected and that timber be harvested based on the principles of continual replenishment of supplies that characterized scientific forestry in continental Europe. A general proclamation was issued prohibiting all unauthorized felling of teak trees, and unclaimed lands were declared property of the Crown. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of acres of land throughout India. The growth of British colonial power in India from the early to the mid-19th century nonetheless ensured continued overexploitation and depletion of the subcontinent's forests. For example, Britain's construction of a railway system throughout India required massive supplies of timber to serve as sleepers, supporting rail tracks. And of course, this was essential to move troops around in India. As a result, the concern of East India Company administrators about the depletion of India's forests continued to grow. These worries only increased as imperial scientific networks spread word of the sensitivity to environmental degradation of ecosystems in other parts of the empire, including Caribbean islands. This mounting concern led to the formation of the Indian Forestry Department in 1864 and the passage of the Indian Forestry Act the following year. The Forest Act of 1865 was the first India-wide forest legislation promulgated by the British, and equally, if not more importantly, the first broad-based environmental law of the 19th century. The Act empowered the colonial government to declare any land covered with trees as government forests and to issue rules for conserving them. The removal of all forest produce was prohibited, and powers were given to local governments to arrest violators. So we see as early as the mid-19th century in the British Empire, the ways in which what we've been discussing playing out on the ground today was already taking place. The enclosure of India's forests gained speed in the period after the creation of the Forestry Department. In 1864, Dietrich Brandeis was made Inspector General of Forests in India. Like many other forest officials in British India, Brandeis was German. The German Forest Service was considered the most scientifically advanced in Europe at the time, but it had also made its reputation by successfully prohibiting customary woodland uses by the German peasantry and by suppressing an 1848 peasant uprising against forest enclosures in the Rhineland region. So we're seeing attacks on the commons, not just in colonial territories, but also within Europe. And there's a connection there. The young Karl Marx, who in the early 1840s was working as editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, wrote scathingly of the Prussian state's criminalization of the traditional practices of the forest-dwelling German peasantry. Quote, all the organs of the state become ears, eyes, arms, legs, and means by which the interests of the forest owner hears, sees, appraises, protects, grasps, and runs, close quote. It was these experiences of scientific management, quote unquote, and draconian policing that made the reputation of German silviculture experts like Dietrich Brandeis. During his time in India, Brandeis essentially blamed customary users of India's forests, including hunters and gatherers, subsistence cultivators, and villagers living nearby, for the problems that the East India Company had created through its excessive exploitation of India's forests. His goal as head of the forestry department was to render the forests economically productive for the empire. And he talked about how he wanted to destroy practices that prevented the improvement of the forests. And this word improvement is particularly important, for by the time Brandeis was writing, the idea of improvement had become central to ideological justifications for enclosure of commonly held land and dispossession of inhabitants in both England and its empire.
If I draw on the book PandaLeaks once more, Wilfried Huismann writes of how the World Wildlife Fund took over the Indian game reserves after the British departed. The organisation then persuaded the Indian government to create reserves where tigers could live undisturbed by human beings. The government proceeded to forcibly expel forest-dwelling tribes, with nearly 1 million people losing their homes. The WWF fully backed this resettlement, obtaining a High Court decision in 1997 which compelled state governments to implement the forced removal of the Adivasi people. After the initial expulsions, certain areas within the park were designated for commercial use. What this means is that the land which 40 villagers once occupied is now a eucalyptus and teakwood plantation. I think it's reasonable to assume it would have been very difficult to justify the removal of indigenous people in order to make way for a commercial plantation. A nature reserve that is rezoned as a plantation, however. Prior to being overthrown by the CIA, one of the practices Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz tried to end was United Fruit buying up all the land in the country for a pittance, then leaving it fallow so as people couldn't use it and would instead be forced to work on their plantations. You could think of this as a relocation of slavery south of the border after its ostensible end in the 1860s. There is a parallel in conservation colonialism in India. Huismann quotes a tribal leader as saying, quote, "We're no longer allowed to keep livestock or harvest honey, the basis of our existence. Every day we're picked up by a truck and brought to a coffee plantation. We have to work there for $2.75 a day, half of what the other workers earn. We have to do it, otherwise we'd starve to death. It's their way of trying to demoralize us." End quote. Huismann describes this as a form of modern-day slavery. Back in Africa, the WWF directly profited from the expulsion of the Batwa people of Uganda, as it now runs an $11,000 a ticket Great African Primate Expedition through their lands. Huismann quotes a report to the United Nations Expert Group on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which focuses on the Batwa. Quote, "Like in other cases where national parks have been established under the guidance of the WWF and other external forces, the indigenous population that had lived there for hundreds or thousands of years in a sustainable way has been evicted from their forest. Their forests have been given into the hands of foreign investors. Tourism is big business, as the fees for hunting go up to the thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars for the killing of a single animal, depending on the game species. Under the cloak of conservationism, the investors want their forests for their purposes alone, without any pygmies." End quote. The author of the report, Dr. Arnold Groh, said of the Batwa, quote, "After they lost their forest, in which they have lived for millennia, the members of the tribe fell into a deep depression. They started to get drunk in the afternoon or take drugs. The desperation was palpable in all the villages that I visited." End quote. Tourism itself is a big industry. After their eviction from the Serengeti, the Maasai resettled in Tanzania. After the country's independence, they were evicted once more, ostensibly for reasons of conservation, but ultimately to make way for an eco-tourist hotel. Huismann writes that, quote, Maasai warriors in their traditional red capes perform tribal dances for the upscale eco-tourists, and the hotel offers excursions to traditional Maasai villages. The noble herdsmen have become dancing beggars, living from the alms of the tourist industry. End quote. A moment ago I mentioned how the United Fruit Corporation controlled Guatemala by buying up land from corrupt governments. More recently, numerous communities have been violently expelled from their homes to make way for conservation projects. Land purchases for the conservation area were in part funded by USAID via the Nature Conservancy, the world's largest conservation organization. It's reported that threats, intimidation, and outright violence have been used to shift people off their land. In one incident, 5 community leaders were murdered. Noticing the parallels with the past, one resident commented that, quote, "We are certain that it was a strategic eviction on the part of the state. It reminds us of the 36 years of war we lived through, because they are using the same methods to kill us. Taking water away from the fish is the only way to kill the fish. It's the same idea. They take away our land, and they are taking away our right to live." End quote. According to community testimonies, after 10 years of conservation, their lands were left devastated by illegal logging operations. The government resorted to brutal eviction tactics after local communities initiated a legal battle. The communities recognized that their organization and resistance was, quote, "an obstacle for the development of businesses on those lands, where they want to build hydroelectric plants, extract oil and water, and promote tourism and plantations." End quote. Conservation evictions are vicious the world over. A 2019 investigation by BuzzFeed revealed that the WWF funds paramilitary forces to ostensibly fight off poaching. These paramilitary groups have been accused of beating, torturing, sexually assaulting, and murdering scores of Indigenous people. It's clear that the WWF knew this was going on and only ever acted to cover it up. I could go on all day giving examples. Survival International's YouTube channel has scores of witness testimonies from all over the world. In total, it's estimated that up to 20 million people have been forcefully displaced for reasons of conservation. I've titled this episode Conservation as Ethnic Cleansing. That's not a description I've seen anyone else use, and I do wonder why. Ethnic cleansing is defined as, quote, "the systemic forced removal of ethnic, racial, or religious groups from a given area with the intent of making the society ethnically homogeneous. Along with direct removal, such as deportation or population transfer, it also includes indirect methods aimed at forced migration by coercing the victim group to flee and preventing its return. These methods include murder, rape, and property destruction." End quote. We could quibble over whether ethnic homogeneity is the goal, but to me, the similarities seem to far outweigh the differences. The weightiness of the words ethnic cleansing seem to be the only ones appropriate in conveying what is being done to people. There are a lot of ways you could analyse the impact of the conservationist efforts, from ensuring access to resources for Western corporations, to contributing to the underdevelopment of third world nations. What's clear is that the conservationist movement, whatever it should be, has been co-opted or even created as a green mask of empire, a way of carrying on imperial policies in an ostensibly more enlightened age. The question this raises then is that if we clearly have very real environmental issues, and we also clearly have environmental canards, which issues fall where? Most specifically, is the big one, global warming, the greatest threat to humanity, or another green mask of empire? Does the corporate imperial structure seek to oppose efforts to restrict carbon so it can continue to greedily gobble up the world? Does it spin out right-wing and conspiratorial propaganda to muddy the waters of the overwhelming scientific consensus? Or has the corporate empire manufactured a fabled enemy in carbon? Is it using a non-existent threat as the ultimate form of resource control? That's where this series will be going. Thank you for listening. I've principally drawn on two books, Wilfried Huismann's PandaLeaks, a book that got involved in a legal battle with the WWF, and Decolonize Conservation, Global Voices for Indigenous Self-Determination, Land, and a World in Common. That's a collection of essays published by Survival International. I also listened to Survival International's Our Land, Our Nature conference, which is incredibly informative and available online. I'll link to that as well as other articles I've referenced in the info box.